I've always found Bill Walsh to be the most fascinating of all football coaches. He's the only head coach I can think of that I ever sought to read about in books and learn more about his life because the whole arc of his career and how he got into coaching and his exit from coaching I found so fascinating, because he was so not the stereotypical football coach. I mean, he looked like a college professor more than a football coach. He was a sort of the opposite of, say, Mike Ditka. Mike Ditka was liked by the media because Mike Ditka was what people think of when they think of a football coach, a hard-nosed guy who, showed emotions on the sidelines and would grab his players and he was more quotable. Mike Ditka entertained the media, you know. And whereas Bill Walsh was a more secretive guy, and he approached football more like an intellectual or an artist. He had the mentality of an artist. He saw designing offensive plays like an art form. And and because he had that mentality of an artist, he was always his own worst critic. He was always so hard on himself and questioning himself. That's why even after they won the Super Bowl in 81, they missed the playoffs in 82 when he was ready to quit. Because he'd been to the mountaintop, that the idea of missing the playoffs a year after that, he was ready to give up. And I can't think of another coach who was that emotional, the way he was just ready, who had just won the Super Bowl the year before and took losing that hard to where he was almost ready to give up. And but that's because he was so hard on himself. That's one of the main reasons it was so hard for him to get a head coaching job from the very beginning, and why he'd been kind of blackballed by Paul Brown, and that he was perceived as being too emotional. You know, that head to be a head coach in the NFL, you're supposed to be a hard-nosed, tough guy who doesn't show emotions. And you know the idea of a head coach who's so impulsive and so temperamental. And I mean, of course, Bill Walsh on the sidelines wasn't someone who was yelling and screaming the way like a John Madden did. Like John Madden was a madman on the sidelines. Bill Walsh was more emotional behind the scenes. He more suffered in silence after games when his team lost. But he still retired even though he didn't suffer on camera as much. He retired after 10 years, just like John Madden did, because John Madden, he wore his emotions on his sleeves. He was a madman on the sideline, and he retired after 10 years because had he coached for 20 or more years, he probably would have died of stress. And Bill Walsh, he only coached for 10 years, but in those 10 years, he aged about 25, 30 years in those 10 years because he suffered a lot when those years when the 49ers didn't win. And I find it very fascinating that, like John Madden, Bill Walsh was one of the few guys that, after a short sort of coaching career, retired and stayed gone. There are so few guys that retire after a short coaching career and don't come back. Say I can only think of Bill Walsh and John Madden as guys who did that, because of course, guys like Bill Parcells or Dick Vermeil came back, and of course even Joe Gibbs, after 12 years with the Redskins, came back in the 2000s. You seem like guys always come back. If they coach for 5 to 10 years and retire, they always seem to come back. But Bill Walsh and John Madden never came back, and I find that very fascinating. Was because coaches with long tenures, guys like Don Shula and Tom Landry, you have to be emotionally detached. Tom Landry was always accused of having no emotions on the sideline, when you couldn't coach as long as he did and live and die with every game. You have to be able to let go. And Bill Walsh didn't have the ability to let go. And he understood that. That's why he had to retire, because he couldn't let go. Because an artist can never let go. You can't do that. Somebody who has that sort of mentality, you know. And his emotional, side. That's what the dynamic between him and Joe Montana was so unusual, because usually when it comes to a coach and a star player, the dynamic is that the star player is the emotional one and the coach is the calming influence. The Michael Jordan, Phil Jackson thing. Usually the player is the fiery one who will yell at his teammates, and the coach is the calm one. That was even the case with Belichick and Brady. Belichick was the one who showed no emotions, and Tom Brady would be the one who'd be yelling on the sidelines and all. I mean, I've even seen Patrick Mahomes throw tantrums on the sideline, whereas Andy Reid always has to be the calm one. Whereas with Bill Walsh and Joe Montana, it was kind of the opposite, where Joe Montana was the calm one and Bill Walsh was the emotional one. And that's why their relationship had a bit more difficulties, because when the one that has the power is the emotional one, then he's going to be in a position to really, do that relationship harm. Whereas like the emotional player is not in a position to do anything to the coach. He's not in a position to to remove the coach from his position or whatever. Whereas the head coach can bench players if he feels like it. And because in that even Bill Walsh's impulsiveness caused a lot of conflict eventually when Joe Montana started having injury problems, and then he got in his mind that, all right, Montana is an older quarterback and injured, so I need a young person that I could possibly replace him with. And but that's all a product of that dynamic of an emotional coach. And even with Terry Bradshaw and Chuck Noll, it was kind of the opposite of that, where Chuck Noll was the stern one, and Terry Bradshaw was the happy-go-lucky one that showed more emotion. Usually that's the dynamic, but it's all, but I said the Bill Walsh and Joe Montana one was a very unique. I can't think of another instance where that was the case, where the player was the calm one and the coach was the emotional one. I also associate Bill Walsh with an era when coaches got credit. Head coaches in professional sports used to get credit for their team's success. You know, going back to, Vince Lombardi and Tom Landry, and along with Bill Walsh, guys of his era like Joe Gibbs got credit for the Redskins' success. And in the 90s, Jimmy Johnson, of course, got credit for the Cowboys' success because everybody knew how important he was. But it seemed like in the 2000s, by the early 2000s, that had all gone away, and the players got all the credit in pro sports. Coaches didn't get any credit at all. I like to think of it as the Jordan effect, because like post Michael Jordan, you know, sports fans just got in their head that the players all that matter and the coaches don't matter. It didn't matter, you know, that Phil Jackson was always the head coach when the Bulls won championships with Michael Jordan. They acted like Phil Jackson's triangle offense had nothing to do with the Bulls' success, even though it was instrumental. And the fact that Jordan retired after the 98 season because Phil Jackson wasn't going to be brought back, that's the main thing that contributed to him retiring. And yet they try to pretend like Phil Jackson didn't matter and it was all Jordan. Coaches don't get any credit. And people like Bill Walsh, in some of the even the books he wrote, the one he wrote a year or two after he retired, that Building a Champion, he acknowledged the importance of coaching when it comes to quarterbacks, and how some quarterbacks careers had been ruined by being drafted by bad teams or going to teams that didn't have a quarterback guru as a head coach who didn't know how to develop a quarterback. Or quarterbacks who, in playing for bad teams, got injuries and their injuries were mismanaged. Talking about guys like Jim Plunkett and guys like that, guys that had they gone to a team that actually had a coach that knew how to coach quarterbacks and knew how to groom quarterbacks, they could have had greater success. It's like when I was a kid, I always felt that Brett Favre, definitely benefited from coaching. That if Mike Holmgren hadn't coached Brett Favre, there's no way Brett Favre would have had the success that he had. And and there are a lot of other quarterbacks, physically gifted quarterbacks, whose careers were either ruined or their careers were less than they should have been because they went to teams that didn't have they had a head coach who didn't know how to manage a talented quarterback. Like Randall Cunningham with the Philadelphia Eagles is a great example. Where they didn't know, where they never built an offense around him. Of course, Buddy Ryan was a defensive guy. He didn't know how to groom a quarterback, and they never had any coaches on offense who knew how to groom. They just tell Randall Cunningham to go out there and use his athleticism to win the game, but they never taught him how to play the quarterback position in the NFL. You know, and even guys that had success, like Terry Bradshaw or John Elway, as rookies, they were thrown to the wolves. They came into the NFL with these golden boy reputations, number one picks. They were going to save the franchise, and they were thrown to the wolves and struggled a lot early on because they didn't have head coaches that knew how to groom quarterbacks. And and they developed a lot of bad habits along the way. Like Terry Bradshaw, like Chuck Noll had no idea how to manage Terry Bradshaw. And eventually they built a good enough team to where Terry Bradshaw was able to have success and win some Super Bowls. But if Terry Bradshaw had gone to a team with a quarterback guru for a head coach, his statistics, career statistics would be a lot better. Because right now his career statistics are not good. And the same thing goes with John Elway. John Elway, his statistics never compared to Dan Marino because he was an athletic quarterback on a team that had nothing around him, and he was basically just told to go out there and win games. And most of his career, his stats were mediocre. And and it wasn't until Mike Shanahan became the head coach, particularly Mike Shanahan after his experience with the 49ers, which seemed to change him as a head coach and make him a better coach, that all of a sudden Mike Shanahan goes to the Broncos and builds a team around Elway and puts him in a system. And his best statistical seasons were some of his last seasons. And because he had a coach that knew how to manage a quarterback and how to build around a quarterback. And in the late 90s, I always felt that if Jake Plummer had been drafted by the Denver Broncos and sat behind John Elway for a couple of years and then been given the job after Elway retired, Jake Plummer would have had a much better career in the NFL. That he wasted so many years with Arizona as a bad team and learning bad habits as young quarterbacks tend to do on bad teams. That by the time he got to the Broncos, Mike Shanahan got as much out of him as he could at that point, but he couldn't fix the damage that had been done. Whereas had Jake Plummer, he drafted Jake Plummer, he would have been a better quarterback. And there are countless examples of quarterbacks like that, talented quarterbacks who were just wasted on bad teams. And Bill Walsh, when he drafted Joe Montana, he groomed Montana to succeed. He set him up to succeed. He would, you know, he would have Steve DeBerg run the offense, and when they got down in the red zone, then he would put Montana in there in a position to score touchdowns to help build up his confidence. And instead of he knew that having throwing Montana out there as a rookie would have destroyed his confidence and ruined his whole career. And and most quarterbacks don't, coaches don't seem to understand that. They just throw so few teams actually are patient enough to actually develop a quarterback. And Joe Montana's technique as a quarterback was simply a product of being a coached by Bill Walsh, because Bill Walsh was a perfectionist. Bill Walsh wasn't the kind of guy who will allow people in his offense to have sloppy technique. He wouldn't allow a quarterback to have, bad footwork or throwing or holding the ball in a bad position before he throws. That's why Joe Montana had like almost perfect quarterbacking technique when he dropped back out of the pocket. His footwork, or he held the ball, his throwing motion. Bill Walsh was always a perfectionist about all of those things, and it was always a product of coaching. If Bill Walsh had coached Brett Favre, he would have Brett Favre would have drove him nuts, because Mike Holmgren let Brett Favre get away with a lot of crazy stuff that he would do because he had a strong arm and he would force stuff and do silly things. And Bill Walsh would have been pulling his hair out. He wouldn't have tolerated any of that. And everybody in his offense, you had to respect Bill Walsh's offense. And as a coach, Bill Walsh showed the importance of coaching with Steve Young. It's like, because Bill Walsh made Steve Young. If Steve Young hadn't been brought to the 49ers by Bill Walsh, he would have been just another running quarterback on a bad team for most of his career. Bill Walsh made Steve Young a passer. Steve Young always had the instincts of a running back. And often, even after he went to the 49ers, that often would get him injured, those instincts of a running back. But Bill Walsh developed his passing skills and made him a passer. And that never would have happened if Bill Walsh hadn't coached Steve Young. And and even Jerry Rice, his career benefited so much from being in Bill Walsh's offense and being coached by him, because Bill Walsh, again, stressed ball placement by the quarterbacks where they threw the passes. And in doing so, he was always setting the wide receiver up to catch the ball in the open field and get yards afterwards. You rarely ever saw Jerry Rice catch a pass having to lay out, diving to catch a pass, or in the middle of the field having to jump up and put his hands over his head and get clobbered by a safety. Most of the time when Jerry Rice caught a pass, it was hitting him right in the chest. And that definitely helped him have a long career. Because a lot of wide receivers that play for teams with strong arm quarterbacks, the quarterbacks always forcing the ball in the spots, and the receivers have to make acrobatic catches, and a lot of times they get creamed by safeties and linebackers going across the middle. No, wide receivers who played with Brett Favre or played with, I mean, Ed McCaffrey was famous for that, playing with John Elway, always making acrobatic catches and getting clobbered. And but the way that 49ers offense was set up, the receiver was meant to catch the ball with separation and be able to run after the catch, and that definitely helped Jerry Rice have a long career. Jerry Rice didn't even get injured until he didn't miss any significant amount of time until like 1997, and that was like his 13th season in the NFL. And Bill Walsh's coaching was so important, and he accomplished so much as a head coach that his philosophy, unlike any other coach I could think of, his philosophy as a coach remained with the team after he retired, where he popularized the idea of scripting the first 25 plays of a game. His strategy, or his intent almost with every game he went into, was to start out fast, build a big lead, and then play downhill. That's why most of the games the 49ers had great success scoring. They scored mostly in the first half and didn't score a lot in the second half of games. They usually like to come out throwing, score a lot in the first half. In the second half, run the ball more and turn their pass rushers loose on the other team and get a lot of sacks. That was in the first Super Bowl that the 49ers won. That was the ideal first half for Bill Walsh when they were up 20 to nothing. But of course, his play calling was so conservative in the second half, they almost blew the lead. It was almost too conservative, but that always seemed to be his goal and when the 49ers didn't start out fast, when those first 25 scripted plays didn't work, that's usually when they were in trouble, you know. I mean, sometimes Joe Montana would save the day, but usually when the 49ers had success, they had success early with those first 25 plays. And scripting plays, now that's normal. Now that's normal for everybody, but when Bill Walsh began, that wasn't normal for 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 guys to script the first 25 plays. You would think that that was always the case. It'd be like directors storyboarding a movie before they film it. They thought that that would always been a normal thing to do, but it wasn't. And even after he retired, even when Mike Holmgren went to the Packers, he was still doing it. And even after Mike Shanahan, his experience with the 49ers and went to the Broncos, he was scripting the first 15, 25 plays of games. And I can't think of another coach who had that kind of influence over how other people coached. And now, you know, so many years after his retirement, it's still normal for the guys to have it go into a game with a planned set of plays to go from the outset. Reading some of the books that Bill Walsh wrote, I always found it very interesting that he always seemed to have a 3-year plan. That's why the 49ers always had the best record like every 3 years, like winning in '84, winning in '81, and winning or having the best record in '81, '84, and '87. He always liked to build a team with, some seasoned Pro Bowl veterans and some well scouted draft picks, go on a run. If they won, then he would sort of restructure the team for a couple of years. People would leave, new people would come in, and then they go for it again. That's why the 49ers would win, and then they would be mediocre for a couple of years, and then they would go for it again. And that was like a deliberate strategy on his part. And the way he restructured the team, that's why there were very few players that were on all four of those teams in the 1980s. There were some guys who were there for one, like Russ Francis or Wendell Tyler, and then there were guys who were there for two, like Fred Dean or Jack Reynolds or Dwight Clark. But very few guys were there for all because of Bill Walsh's, deliberate sort of constantly shuffling, talent to upgrade when he felt that the team was lacking at certain positions. You know, and because of that philosophy of that 3-year plan, Bill Walsh, if had he remained the 49ers coach, I don't think they would have ever won back-to-back championships. It's like after they failed to win in '87, he didn't expect them to win in '88. He was expecting to go for another championship, maybe in '89 or '90 if he'd remained the coach. He didn't expect to win in '88. They expected to win in '87, but '88 was such up and down, emotional year. And by the end of the year, the emotions of the team got so high that they actually did get in to that state that they were the last time that they won the championship when they were an emotional team. And and that emotion carried over to the very next season. And the only reason that the 49ers won back-to-back championships was because of Bill Walsh's retirement and because of all of the animus that was built up against him by the way that he, was always managing players and is kind of, you know, but in a business-like way, trying to improve the team, upgrading talent, bringing in veterans, getting rid of, phasing people out, and putting in young guys rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And there were a lot of guys on the team that despised him. And I'm sure that his treatment of Montana probably contributed to some of the guys on the team disliking him because Joe Montana was popular with the team, and juggling quarterbacks is never a good idea because that disrupts the chemistry of a team. And the players, so many players despised him. The whole 1989 season was devoted to sticking it to Bill Walsh. They want to win a championship to prove that they didn't need him, and and that wouldn't have happened if he remained the coach. And Bill Walsh as a head coach, um, I have to say, definitely the worst idea that he ever had as a head coach. The greatest sort of argument to his genius label was the idea that he felt that a quarterback competition was good for the team. The idea that he ever thought that playing one quarterback one half and another quarterback the second half was a good idea is amazing to me. For a guy that seemed like such a smart guy, he actually thought that was how you, even though he'd won two Super Bowls, he thought that was a good idea. I mean, like in the mid 1980s, there was a large amount of quarterback injuries to the extent that they added that grasp and control rule. So when a defensive lineman, when some defensive player grabbed a quarterback, they would immediately just blow the whistle and say it was a sack to keep the quarterback from getting injured. And that's probably one of the main reasons he went out and got Steve Young was because so many quarterbacks were being injured. But the idea that the juggling quarterbacks, bringing in quarterbacks in like a situational manner, that any coach would think that that's a good idea is amazing to me. And I mean, like, and considering, I mean, Joe Montana at that point had already won two Super Bowls, and I can't think of another quarterback, a top quarterback in the last 20, 30 years who had to deal with that, regardless of how they played. Brett Favre never was being juggled with another quarterback like that. Peyton Manning was never being juggled like that, regardless of how he played, being benched or having some other guy constantly being almost the coach basically telling him, if you don't play well, I'm going to put this other guy in there. Like, that's not how you win championships. I mean, Tom Landry learned this in 1971 when he was juggling two quarterbacks when the Cowboys were kind of struggling. But then once he decided that Roger Staubach was his starter, the Cowboys just steamrolled their way to their first Super Bowl. And yet so many years later, Bill Walsh seemed to thought that was a good idea to juggle quarterback. Even the idiot Mike Martz, the dumbest coach in history, knew that juggling quarterbacks was not a good idea. So after he shortened Kurt Warner's career with the St. Louis Rams, he got Kurt Warner out of there and he gave the job to Mark Bolger. He didn't alternate between the two. By 2003, he just gave the job to Mark Bolger. Because even that idiot knows you can't juggle quarterbacks. You have to make a decision. You know, because confidence is a very fragile thing. It doesn't matter how long a guy's played any professional sport. When his confidence has been shattered, that's hard to get back. And it's hard for me to imagine that Montana's confidence hadn't been hurt by being treated like that by the guy who groomed him and made him a championship quarterback, and then all of a sudden suggesting that he didn't have any faith in him anymore. Because I said early on in their relationship, Bill Walsh did everything he could to build up Joe Montana's confidence when Steve DeBerg was the quarterback. And then Bill Walsh traded Steve DeBerg because he wanted to avoid a quarterback controversy. Steve DeBerg was a popular guy on the 49ers, and he knew if he kept him on the roster, there might be some people clamoring for him to play, especially if Joe Montana struggled. So he got rid of Steve DeBerg. And yet, only a handful of years later, he thinks that juggling Steve Young and Joe Montana was a good idea. And and it had to have had some effect on Joe Montana. And Bill Walsh already had a reputation for phasing out veterans for young talent. And it was very clear that Bill Walsh brought in Steve Young in an effort to phase out Montana and put the younger guy in there. He did that at every position. He did that. That was his sort of reputation. And the ideal situation for um, for Bill Walsh would have been for Joe Montana to play badly and for Steve Young to be brought in and be the hero and win the game. Bill Walsh never admitted this in any of the books that I've read or interviews that I've heard. I've never heard Bill Walsh admit that his intent was to replace Montana with Steve Young. He never admitted. Even any books I wrote, any time he spoke about that period of '88 when he always made a reference to Joe Montana's physical health and that being the reason why Steve Young played. He never suggested that he was trying to replace Montana, you know, because I think he never got any real encouragement to replace Montana with Steve Young. He never had anybody tapping him on the shoulder saying that he should let Steve Young play. It was always something that was in his mind. But Joe Montana again was popular with the 49ers players and coaches, and he couldn't and Bill Walsh couldn't get anybody to go along with it. He even asked his assistant coaches what they thought about trading Montana. He couldn't get anybody to think it was a good idea. And that's the main reason he always ended up going back to Montana because he couldn't get anybody to tap him on the shoulder. As I say, the perfect situation for Bill Walsh would have been in that playoff game against the Vikings after the '87 season and Joe Montana struggled. If he brought in Steve Young and Steve Young saved the day and the 49ers won that game against the Vikings, that would have been a justification to give Steve Young the job. But that didn't happen. The 49ers lost anyway. And after that, Bill Walsh didn't really know what to do. Because Steve Young never really became the hero that he wanted him to. He set him up to be the hero, but he didn't do it. So Bill Walsh didn't really know where to go. Yeah, and eventually, the way things he always ended up going back to Montana and things worked out by the end of the '88 season, but it wasn't by design. It wasn't he was always ended up having to go back to Montana, but the goal was always to replace Montana with Steve Young. And being that he was running the show talent wise and not just the head coach, I can understand his position always thinking about the future. Juggling quarterbacks, however, that is probably the greatest sort of argument against Bill Walsh, that genius label that Bill Walsh had. But that label, I think that label came from the San Francisco media. It wasn't the national media that gave Bill Walsh that label because I don't think Bill Walsh was ever embraced by the national media until he won his last championship. Because like throughout the mid 1980s, people scoffed at that label. Even after he'd won two championships, after the Bears won in such dominant fashion in '85, and after the Giants won in '86, including blowing out the 49ers, people scoffed at that the idea of this guy's a genius. Like, give me a break. But then when the 49ers won their third title and they were the team of the decade, then everybody came back around to that label and started calling him it again. You know, because lots of coaches get that sort of label by fooling people because they're winning with a lot of talent on their team. Bill Walsh, he deserved that label regarding winning titles without much talent, particularly those first two championships that the 49ers won. He was winning with smoke and mirrors. They were fooling people, and he had very little talent of note, and yet in '81, the first NFC team to win 13 games, like Tom Landry had never won 13 games, Bud Grant never won 13 games. That with that team with a lot of nobodies, won 13 games in the regular season and won the Super Bowl. Like that, I understand why people would have given some people would have given him that label because his high percentage passing offense um, at the time, I mean, it wasn't anything new. That what they call the West Coast offense, had been around for decades before that. He just popularized it with a team that won the Super Bowl. But there was always this misconception of Bill Walsh as some pass happy coach of some finesse, aka soft offense. Bill Walsh was, the media spoke of Bill Walsh like he was Don Coryell. Bill Walsh, the 49ers were not the Chargers. The 49ers were not the Dolphins with Dan Marino, who passed on every down. The 49ers always had a balanced attack when they won championships. And even if they didn't rush for a lot of yards, Bill Walsh would attempt. In 1981, the 49ers weren't ranked very high when it came to rushing yards. They were probably down like the bottom 10 of the league when it came to yards, but they didn't have any good running backs. But in terms of attempts, they were number 6 in the NFL. That lets you know that Bill Walsh wanted to establish the run. He just didn't have the talent to have a good running attack. Whereas by the time he got to 1984, he traded draft picks and gotten Wendell Tyler and drafted Roger Craig. And the 49ers had a much better running attack in 1984, a top ranking rushing attack in 1984. And even by the time they were trying to go for another title in 1987, in terms of yards, they had the number one rushing attack in 1987 when they were 13-2. Yeah. And every year that they won the Super Bowl, 81, 84, 88, 89, every single playoff game that they played, they had over 100 yards rushing. So obviously the 49ers were not just a team that passed all the time. It was a high percentage passing game, but Bill Walsh's idea of offense, the whole idea of high percentage offense in his mind, he was not against the run, obviously, because running the ball is the ultimate high percentage play. It's very hard for a quarterback to miss a handoff to a running back, but it's limiting. So many offenses are limited to running the ball or throwing down the field to receivers, low percentage passes. The further you throw the ball, the lower percentage the pass it is, because a high likelihood is going to be incomplete. Bill Walsh wanted to his idea of high percentage offense was to, rather than limit the running attack to the running back, a high percentage passing attack incorporates everybody. It includes the wide receivers, the tight ends, as well as the backs, getting the ball to them in a position where they could run after the catch. It opened up so many possibilities for your offense to have big plays when you can get the ball into the hands of any of your great athletes at the tight end position, the wide receiver position, or your running back or your fullback, and have them get big plays rather than just handing the ball off or throwing deep. And that was the genius of the whole high percentage offense that he popularized. But he was always about running the ball, and he wasn't. I wouldn't call him, a hard-nosed football coach that just wanted to pound the ball on people, but he wasn't some finesse coach that was opposed to running. His teams ran the ball a lot. I mean, the drive that led to the catch that Dwight Clark made, the 49ers ran the ball in that drive as much as pass. And probably the best game that Bill Walsh ever called was the '88 NFC Championship game in Chicago, where they ran and passed, ran and passed. That was the most balanced play calling he'd ever had, I think, in a game. They didn't pass in the first half and run in the second half. They were passing, running, and they were balanced the entire game and dominated the Bears. And that was probably the best game he ever called. Anytime the 49ers, every time the 49ers were dominant, they were always able to run the ball. So why is it that they were perceived as being some team that never ran the ball? I was always puzzled by that. It's like the media in the early '80s just got into their head that Bill Walsh was some coach of some soft offense that passed on every down, and people just completely just ignored the facts. They just created this idea in their head. And and Bill Walsh, that was probably the main similarity between Bill Walsh and Joe Gibbs, was that they both liked two back offenses. It's like every time the 49ers had success in the 80s, they always had a two back offense. In 81, they had Earl Cooper and Ricky Patton. In 1984, they had Roger Craig and Wendell Tyler, and of course in '88 and '89 they had Roger Craig and Tom Rathman. They always had a two-headed running attack, and Joe Gibbs with the Redskins was the same way. He always had a two-headed running attack. John Riggins and Joe Washington, or Timothy Smith and George Rogers, or Gerald Riggs and Ernest Biner for his last championship. He always liked to have a two-back system, rather didn't rely just on one running back to give the ball 30 times a game. That's why Bill Walsh, traded draft picks and didn't draft Eric Dickerson and traded and got Wendell Tyler and drafted Roger Craig. You know, it was also a business decision too, because Bill Walsh was obviously a very economic guy. Rather than drafting some guy that he more than likely would have to pay a lot of money, bring in some guys who can produce, who are definitely a lot cheaper to have. Wendell Tyler was a good running back, but he wasn't, Hall of Fame bound running back. And Roger Craig was, of course, a rookie drafted. So having those two guys was a lot more economic than bringing in Eric Dickerson, who you'd have to give the ball 30 times a game and pay more money. So that sort of thinking also contributed to that the genius label. But the 49ers, usually when the 49ers were a one-dimensional offense, they usually meant they were losing. When Joe Montana threw the ball 40, 50, 60 times, they usually lost that game. You know? And Bill Walsh had a propensity for making talent better. He would take guys like Dwight Clark, a 10th round draft pick, and he put him in his system. And for a couple of years, Dwight Clark was like a top receiver in the NFL. He led the league like in receptions in '81 and '82 before his knee injury in '83 caused his, play to decline. And of course, that decline caused Bill Walsh to draft Jerry Rice. You know, but Bill Walsh had a top offense through his system alone. That the 49ers didn't have a bunch of star players you just put them out there and score points. It was the system that you put the guys in, and even if the guys weren't very talented, you could still have success because the system caused wide receivers to get open, and it's just a matter of having a quarterback who could get the ball there. And in Bill Walsh's system, nobody was bigger than the system. Everybody had to be in sync, you know. Because sometimes, historically, sometimes talent succeeds without a system. Guys like Randy Moss or Barry Sanders, those guys, like Randy Moss, you just threw the ball up there and he went and got it. Or Barry Sanders, you just gave him the ball, and sometimes he was going to break one, and sometimes he was going to, lose 20 yards trying to break one. But you knew eventually he was going to break one. It had nothing to do with the system. Randy Moss was the opposite of Jerry Rice. Jerry Rice was not a receiver. You just threw the ball up there, and he went and got it with his freakish talent. Jerry Rice was a great athlete, but he operated within a system. And and guys like Emmitt Smith and Terrell Davis were the opposite of Barry Sanders because they actually had, good offensive lines and systems designed for the running backs to have success rather than have to improvise so much. And Bill Walsh set up for the future. As I said, that he was always thinking, because he ran the whole show, he was always thinking about the future. And this is one of the things that made the 49ers in the 80s so different from the other teams that won 4, 5, or 6 championships within a decade. The way Bill Walsh managed talent, because other coaches like Chuck Noll or Tom Landry, as the 80s progressed, the teams got worse. Like the moment the 80s began, the Steelers, all that great talent in the 70s got old, and the Steelers immediately became a mediocre franchise at best in the 80s. And the Cowboys in the 80s, the decline was a little bit slower, but by the mid 80s, the talent gradually left the team, and by 87, 88, they were a bad team. It wasn't because Tom Landry forgot how to coach. It was because there was a decline in talent. Bill Walsh was always about developing new talent to replace old talent. He never put himself in a situation where he had a team with just nothing but old guys on it. Most franchises lose a QB a franchise QB and spend decades looking for a new franchise QB. You know, it's like the Buffalo Bills lost Jim Kelly after '96, and they took them like 2 decades before they got Josh Allen. And teams like the Broncos are still looking for a franchise quarterback after John Elway. You know, of course, I thought Mike Shanahan was gonna build that with Jay Cutler, but Josh McDaniels screwed that up. That he was going to make him great, but some franchise. It's very the Packers are the only franchise I can think of who always seems to have an immediate replacement for their franchise quarterback. Most teams don't. Bill Walsh was always thinking about the future, and had Bill Walsh still been the coach of the 49ers through the 90s, he would have been grooming another quarterback to replace Steve Young. If he's still, and the 49ers would have had a quarterback when Steve Young went down. And you could tell he wasn't in charge at that point. And because of the way Bill Walsh managed talent, was always developing new talent, the 49ers by the end of the 80s, they was so different from every other team that won 4, 5, 6 championships in a decade. Because usually when a team wins that many championships, the team that wins the last championship is not a very of all the teams, it's usually a, one of the weaker teams that won a championship. It's usually a team that's in decline, not the most dominant team. The 1979 Steelers, they won the championship, but that team was so turnover prone and they had to come from behind in the Super Bowl to beat the Rams. They were not the best Steelers team that won. The Lakers in 1988, they had to it took them 7 games to beat the Detroit Pistons. And then of course the next year the Pistons swept them. That was not the best Lakers team that won that last championship. And of course, the 1998 Bulls were not the best of those Bulls teams because they won 72 games in 96, 69 games in 97, and then 62 games in 98. They were in the games. It wasn't they were not dominant. Even though they did beat the Jazz, it was not in dominant fashion. They had to work really hard, and they even had the last one. They had to win on the road because the Jazz had home court advantage in that series. The team that wins the last championship is usually not the best of the teams that win championships. But the '89 49ers are often referred to by a lot of people as the best of those teams, primarily because they dominate the playoff run that they had was so dominant. But that '89 49er team was also one of the youngest teams in the NFL at the time. They had a handful of guys who were there from the very beginning of the championships, but most of the team was very young. And that was all a product of Bill Walsh. And that's why that team, you could argue that '89 team was the best of those teams and most dominant, at least in the postseason. But that's all a product of Bill Walsh, and that makes that team stand out from all the other teams that win a bunch of championships in decades. Usually, the last team is not the team that wins in the most dominant fashion. Usually the team in a decade ascends to a certain point where they're most dominant, and then they descend, and they might win a couple of championships while they're descending, but the best team is the team that wins the second or third championship, not the last one. And because of all that youth on that team, even after the 1990 season, the 1990 season was sort of a watershed moment for the franchise where so many guys left after 1990, guys who were there from the beginning, like or guys who either left the team, like Ronnie Lott or Roger Craig, or guys that retired, like Keena Turner and Eric Wright and those guys. And of course, that no one knew it at the time, but that was going to be Joe Montana's last season too. All these veteran guys were gone, and yet the 49ers still continued to win after that. That was because of the way Bill Walsh managed talent. All these veteran guys left, but they still had a lot of talent, young talent after that. And, and that's all Bill Walsh. There might be other coaches that have more championships. There might be other coaches that have more overall wins. But there's no coach that I find more fascinating than Bill Walsh in terms of his personality, in terms of the way he did business, the way he treated the whole sport of football, his whole mentality and approach, and the way he dealt with talent, and the incredible impact that he's had on the sport is unquestionable. Like he might be the most influential coach of the last 50 years in terms of how so many people try to emulate what he did. Not just his offensive game planning, but just how he managed talent. And and that's all I have to say. I just had to get that off of my chest because, I continue to be fascinated by Bill Walsh. Thank you.